Thank you everybody for joining, and welcome to the Ampersand and Ampersand Lean Startup Meets the Regulatory Market. What we're going to do is just quickly run through a few introductions, and then we'll kind of get in the meat of it. The way that we've kind of created this webinar is that, as you'll see from my background, I have the sort of clinical background where we've been working in a highly regulated environment developing our product. And then Ivo comes from a technical background who can really talk in a lot of detail about the agile process and how these two tie together. So next slide, please, Ivo. So a bit of background for myself. I was a former clinician, so I was an NHS doctor for over 10 years now. And during that time, I was also a medical officer with the Royal Marines, so got out and about. Then in 2014, I really started to find my way into tech in a more significant way. I was part of the NHS Clinical Entrepreneur Programme, and through that time, I've then sort of started the ideation of some core ideas of Umed, which we'll talk about in more detail, and then started working with Ampersand shortly after that, and have been working closely ever since.
Ivo. My name is Ivo Ivanov, and I'm a part of the IT industry since more than 15 years, or more like 18 years now. I was involved in many projects related to the clinical research and healthcare fields, and also in some large projects for the NHS, especially the Health Research Authority here in the UK, but also in multiple agile projects, and I've been leading software development teams since more than 10 years now. And currently I'm being a CTO of two companies at the same time, Ampersand and BGO Software.
Great. So what we'll just do is just give a little bit of background in terms of the market and how kind of digital is fitting into all of this. So we know that there's these enormous challenges that exist that have been talked about extensively, which we know that digital can go a long way to addressing. So the aging patient population, the increasing spend on healthcare as a percentage of GDP, both in the UK and overseas, whereas in the US it's now getting close to 20% of GDP, which is really an unsustainable amount. So there's this huge shift towards actually how can we lower the costs of both delivering healthcare and concurrently improve outcomes for patients, and particularly within that, this kind of shift towards this idea of preventative medicine, where can we use digital tools, digital therapeutics, and data to actually kind of reduce that front end burden, which will trickle down into savings across the whole end-to-end spectrum. So kind of what we really wanted to look at is, well, if you want to build a digital product in the healthcare sector, which from my background actually spans into the kind of life science pharma sector as well, what are the things you need to think about? How can Agile help? And I'll just give a bit of background on kind of my journey and how it's kind of panned out, which hopefully will be useful to those of you in the audience. So like most founders, I suspect we have a lot of domain specific knowledge about our area, but very few of us have any real deep technical understanding of actually how to develop a product or what's involved with it, or any really understanding of agile process as well. So like most founders, when I first started out, I had a reasonably clear vision of what I thought it was that we wanted to build, and also a very good understanding of the healthcare market and what I thought users wanted out of the product that we were creating. But then when I started to work with Ampersand, it's also important to say, but before I started working with Ampersand, I actually worked with another development agency, which was a very, there's a very different experience to that we experienced with Ampersand. It's just worth kind of going through that in a little bit more detail. And what we did when we started working with Ampersand is really kind of trying to go through this process of testing and evaluating. So to give a bit of background, the sort of first part of the Umed product was really looking at how can we create a discussion and consensus forum around the scientific literature that informs clinical practice, because there's this huge variation. And through that, we wanted to kind of create a digital product that clinicians could use to very easily access and then create the consensus around that. And one of the things we wanted to test is, well, actually, you know, how do we drive user acquisition on this, which you know, is a fundamental part of most kind of B2C marketing or B2C businesses, was that we need to kind of create that audience. How are we going to do it? And so one of the things we wanted to test as part of that product is, well, actually, how can we use medical conferences as a method to drive adoption of users in a way that would reduce cost? So we started building out some specific bits of functionality, testing that with inside different medical conferences, as well as using other channels to try and drive that kind of user acquisition. And there's a huge amount that learned from that. So much so, in fact, if we go on to the next slide, it became clear that really there wasn't really a way that we could identify that allowed us to be able to drive those user acquisition costs for that original product down to something that was going to create a profitable business, or anything that was going to kind of create meaningful growth. And that was really useful, because although we'd spent a small amount of time, money and effort, it wasn't so much that we weren't able to actually recognize that early enough and pivot towards what ended up actually being a very different kind of product altogether. And that didn't happen overnight. That happened over a period of 6 months, and continued working with Ampersand throughout that process and trying to apply those agile methodologies. And so what we ended up shifting to is something that's actually much more about the research process itself, and through that whole process of working with clinicians, working with researchers for sort of Umed 1.0, it became clear there was actually a much bigger issue that we could address through digital products, which is essentially what we're doing now. And to give a bit of background on that, that's essentially linking electronic health record data to scalable, repeatable engagement to disintermediate and therefore reduce the cost and time associated with delivering these research studies. So as it ended up, a very significant shift away from the original kind of core vision, which I started out with in 2014. But that kind of iteration process and willingness to recognize when things aren't right through the agile process has been extremely useful. I think for me, we can kind of talk about some of the key takeaways when we do a bit of Q&A between Ivo and myself. But even with the process that we applied, I think there's so much more we could have done to start that agile process even sooner, by doing some kind of pre-product research, testing different assumptions, and taking much smaller steps in that product development process earlier on. And I think we would have achieved even more quicker than we did. But hopefully that's a bit of useful background. I'll hand over to Ivo to talk a bit more about Agile itself.
Yeah. Thanks, Matt. Just taking the chance to mention that all of you can use the Q&A button, and during the presentation and the slides, you can just type down some questions which might appear, so we can answer them at the end of the presentation. So about the lean concept and agile, pretty much what Matt was explaining is that his startup was lean before he even knew it, and we also tend to give the best of advice which we could in order to direct the whole development and the whole product concept to use that lean concept and lean approach. Just a little bit of a background. The lean concept originates back at the beginning of the century. I mean, the beginning of 20th century even, because some of the principles used by Henry Ford in manufacturing and later by Toyota in the 50s were pretty much covering this lean concept without even being called lean. And the main purpose of lean is practically that we need to create value, and we need to create that value with almost zero waste. And by waste, I mean waste of resources, waste of budgets, and anything which is done unnecessary and which is not directly related to the main goal. And the main goal is usually to solve a particular problem from the real life. And lean teaches that we need to have a clear vision about the problem and to create the value around it. And this value should serve to the purpose of solving this real life problem. Basically, we should never develop something or create something just for the sake of creation if it doesn't have a purpose. And also, when the lean principle is followed precisely, there's a loop which is called build, measure, and learn. Practically, we need to build in small steps, and then what the result of our efforts should be pushed to the public, and we need to gather their opinions and to gather information during that measurement steps, and then we need to learn from that and continue improving. So this happens in cycles, and we need to find the best length of those cycles and to be able to identify the deliverables and try to learn and pivot like Matt did with his identification of the client acquisition problem. And also we need to deliver exactly what is needed and exactly when it's needed, because even if we take into account over-delivering might also be a problem, because that means we didn't focus on what was exactly needed. We did something which wasn't needed at that step, but probably needed later in time. But that's again something which could be considered as an issue if we are truly lean. Basically, Agile and its subset, which is called Scrum, they are derivatives from Lean, and they practically put some kind of framework on the top of Lean, which is a process which can be followed, which is a particular way how the teams collaborate. And basically, Agile is all about creating interdisciplinary teams. Such a team can consist of doctors, statisticians, mathematicians, IT personnel, or whoever is could be involved in a project. But the key thing for the team is that the team should be able to deliver by itself. Without external help. So it should be a standalone unit which has all the necessary capabilities to be able to execute this build, measure, and learn cycle, and to be able to deliver on its own. This practically the whole frame is around this continuous improvement and continuous delivery. The steps should be always evaluated. Basically, after each delivery, we need to ask ourselves, was that needed? And was that the pure minimum which would serve to the customer purposes and to solve the particular problems before moving on to the next one. So if we try to combine them, basically Lean is building the right things, and Agile is building the things right, because it gives us the framework and the steps which we need to follow in order to build the desired result. This is a bit more detailed diagram, which also goes a bit outside of Lean and Agile. And also, if you look at it has two layers practically, a concrete layer and abstract layer, where everything starts with identifying the problem. In this particular case, of course, there are many problems in healthcare and many things which could be improved. Starting from the design thinking part, many people are even considering that as a separate science, and there are even whole books which are written on that topic, design thinking. But starting from there, we need to first identify the problem which we want to solve, and then to feel the need of solving that problem and to dedicate ourselves on that purpose. This is the empathy phase here, and that is the real life. But after that, we're going to the abstract, where we start thinking about possible solutions of this particular problem, and the solutions can be a lot of thinking can be done, and most of them could be even not feasible. Some of them could be unrealistic. Some of them could be very far from the reality and the current state of technology, and even the current state of level of understanding of the people, even if you want to deliver something to the patient and to be able to engage them and to train them. So after this definition of many different ideas, we need to pick a few of them and go to the Lean cycle, where we need to experiment and see which of those ideas are really worth it to develop, and to basically to put an effort in them. And this effort has to be the pure minimum, and we need to validate it always. So if we look at the Lean cycle and the Agile cycle, they're pretty much like cogwheels which are connected, and they spin together, and they also have this touch base where, after you experiment and learn initially, you reach to a point where you decide that this idea is time to be implemented from technical perspective. Then you can go into this software development cycle and start running the Agile process. It doesn't hurt to do this in parallel, basically, because while a particular Agile team is developing software, other part of the team can go through the measurements, requirement gathering, and the Lean cycle as well. So if we take a quick look at the Agile cycle, there's something which is called product backlog, and this is pretty much the list of features which have to be developed in each iteration. But before even considering starting the first iteration or the first sprint, which they call it in Scrum, we need to have this product backlog prepared at the Lean phase, at the time when we measure, identify ideas and learn. So we need to have at least the backlog for the first one or two sprints. Otherwise, we're going to waste a lot of time during the sprint itself to gather that and to clarify particular items for it. The product backlog usually contains a list of items which are called user stories, and this is basically a description of the functionality in the way which it brings benefit for the user. And writing a user story is a completely separate science, but they have to be written in a way which could be understood well by the team and be able to deliver some working functionality. Having the list of user stories goes to a phase which is called sprint planning, and this is practically taking a user story from the product backlog bucket and putting it into a sprint bucket, and that happens by priority. So we always need to keep the product backlog listed by priority, and each of the user stories also need to have evaluation from the technical team. Let's say how much effort is linked to each of the user stories. When we plan the sprint, then we do sprint execution, which is the actual doing of the work, and basically doing the development or whatever else work is linked to the user story. And the result of this sprint execution, which for every project it could be slightly different, but the best recommendations would be between 2 and 3 weeks. We need to have a shippable increment, which means that this is a portion of the project or part which could be delivered to the client or to the end user, so we can use that learning phase and to be able to gather opinions, to be able to measure what we did, and also to use this as a base to decide either to pivot to something else or to be kind of stubborn and continue doing this until we make it perfect. There's a phase which is called a sprint review, which is practically a meeting of the Agile team, and this is kind of lessons learned meeting, which where everyone says what were the obstacles, what we did good, what we didn't do so good, and we need to after that use these lessons to run the next sprint in a better way. There are many details in that, and I also can ask you to write us emails and to ask questions related to that. I already see that there's one question. So there's a question which says, if the project wasn't developed in Agile in the beginning, could it be Agile moving forward? Basically, it could. We just need to identify and practically we can consider this as one second to go back. We can consider it as a phase where we already came to the build phase, and we already have a product backlog. So let's say if the current phase of the project is not Agile, we need to stop there and try to gather a product backlog, which help us to identify where we're going from that step forward, and then start doing these Agile cycles based on the backlog and connect there. Okay, so running Agile sprints is sometimes quite challenging, and especially when the team consists of people with different experience and different scientific fields as well. But there's something also called team calibration, which happens during the first several iterations, which pretty much everyone learns how to work with the others, and this is the core strength, because one of the Agile principles is that the people need to take responsibility and take ownership on the tasks they perform. And at the daily meetings, each person has to answer 3 questions: what I did yesterday, what I'm planning to do today, and what are the obstacles. So everyone is responsible in front of the whole team about his tasks and he owned, and also everyone could help the others if he sees that an obstacle which was reported by a member of the team is in his domain, and he can contribute. Yeah, all of this sounds great, but when we run digital health projects, the life is not that simple. And I'm going to show you a few obstacles and few issues which normally appear when you run such a project in a regulated environment. So the first one, which is valid not only for healthcare projects, but for projects in general, is this lack of specifications. And because some people believe that being agile means that you are allowed to work without specifications and without proper documentation of what you're doing. But that's completely not true, because the user stories which go into the product backlog and in the sprints themselves are practically the specifications the engineering team is using to develop features. And if those user stories are not written well enough, then there's a very big risk the deliverables not to match to the customer expectations. Also, the quality might be a big issue here, because sometimes during the sprint planning, many people make the mistake to ignore the time which is needed for testing the shipment to the customer. And when the sprint is planned, all the capacity of the team is planned against doing new features and development, but we quite often forget the time, the QA time, and the time which is needed to verify and validate what has been done before showing it to someone. Also, Agile often suffers by change control issues, which means that everyone, again, being Agile, thinks that we can change everything and do that all the time. But in the real life, it's really difficult if you push changes after the first half of the sprint, and if you approach the end of the sprint and someone puts changes into the deliverables, it becomes pretty hard to control what's being delivered and its quality. So something which is an advice usually is to avoid putting user stories after the first half of the sprint is passed. So let's say if you run 2-week sprints, you must avoid putting user stories in the pipeline after the first week is passed. Also, Agile could often become a money pit. And this is one of the big risks there, because you know, this continuous improvement usually implies something like unlimited budget. So we are allowed to burn money and burn effort until we make our solution perfect. But in real life, that doesn't happen. And even if we are agile in executing the project, we are not agile with the budgets, and there's a cap on the budget which always need to be considered, and we need to fit our sprints, our whole project scope, and the number of those sprints into the budget. Otherwise, the whole thing leads to some unnecessary spending and something which is purely not lean. We are doing waste, and we are wasting resources. I just saw that there are a couple of questions. Is it better to outsource or build an in-house team? Well, it depends. I think from my current experience, which is more than 15 years, as we've mentioned, I think the best way to approach this is a mixed team, which consists of in-house people who understand the business very well, and they understand what their customer needs, and they have the vision about the problems and their solutions. and to outsource the implementation and the engineering work. So these mixed teams can work really well together in Agile, because the internal expertise could be combined with the external expertise, and everyone can focus on what they do best.
And just to add something useful from my end on that, I completely agree. I think there's having a completely in-house team, I think, means that you often, unless you're very lucky, I think you lose the kind of wider breadth of experience that people like Ivo bring in terms of their seeing lots of these projects and kind of holding you to account in a way that I think some internal teams you can end up becoming in a way less accountable, because you're kind of doing it all in-house. But I do also think, you know, particularly in the from the kind of healthcare highly regulated area, there's a huge amount of value in having domain specific knowledge inside that in-house team, and there's also that kind of wider piece as well when you're a founder and it's early on, and if you're doing it with a relatively small team, having in-house, I think, means that you can get a more kind of culture and buy-in from all of those kind of in-house teams, which I think then sort of builds momentum in a way that's quite difficult to do if you're doing it purely outsourced. Just my observations.
Thanks, Matt. So another two possible issues, and they shouldn't be neglected at all, are the validation and compliance, which are crucial for digital health, because this regulated environment practically sometimes is dealing with people's lives, and there should be very heavy validation and very heavy compliance requirements on everything which we do on that field. If we link that to Agile, this is a real problem, because at some point when the project is completed, or after several sprints, we need to reach to a point where the product which we've created has to be validated, checked for compliance, and then released. And all of this procedure is not Agile at all, because basically that goes out of the scope of the team itself, and puts additional dependency on external people, which might be government bodies, it could be auditors, consultants, and people who are not part of the team. So that goes outside of the Agile team control. And also, at this point of time, the deliveries stopped being Agile, because we cannot basically implement more changes, because the system becomes validated, and we cannot continue throwing additional functionality, changing functionality. We need to do something which we internally in IT we call code freeze, and stop doing any software changes, because the system now has to be validated and put in production, dealing with real data. That doesn't mean that the next versions of the system can't be developed in Agile, but at the time when we need to deliver that to the production environment, and need to start working with real data, the Agile stops, and practically this phase of the project is pretty much a waterfall model, where every phase has to be executed after the other. This validation and compliance is something which definitely has to be planned properly. And even if we run a set of sprints to develop the software, the actual deployment is non-Agile, and the releases are not Agile because of this reason. And that was my last slide, and the next one is the Q&A session, and we've already answered a few questions which appeared, and I suggest that we can run that in two phases. The first one would be myself asking a few questions to Matt, which might be useful for everyone to know, but also feel free to type questions, and also you can send an unmute request if you want to speak and ask us something. And yeah, so Matt, something which probably could be useful is if you can share what was the most difficult thing from your side as an entrepreneur who was running this Agile project.
Yeah, no, thanks, Ivo. And I think there's a couple of things, because I think in healthcare, and coming from a kind of clinical background, there's this aversion to putting something out there that's not quite ready yet. And by not quite ready, I mean it doesn't necessarily do everything that you want it to do. You know, from a kind of complete specification, doesn't necessarily always look as polished as potentially you would always like it to. And I think that's a real challenge, because I think in healthcare there's, both from consumers, whether they be clinicians or patients or both, there's a very high bar of expectation in terms of what the product should do and what it should look like. And I think and combined with that, there's also generally a pretty high bar in terms of regulatory requirements as well, and particularly within life sciences and pharma world as well. So I think the challenge that I had was kind of generally trying to kind of reduce down what you know, the kind of MVP or that first kind of lean cycle could look like, and what the steps were, because I think there's just this, and everybody around you in terms of your advisors and other people that are involved and other people in healthcare are kind of I kind of don't understand this lean process and the agile process that go with it, so always pushing you to try to do more stuff with the products rather than do less. So I think that's one thing, and it may just be also just worth, from my own experience from a kind of healthcare perspective, one of the things I've learned is that inside that kind of lean cycle that you described, Ivo, there's I think there's a lot more that we could have done and now try to do, to kind of not shortcuts, not quite the right word, but try to get around some of the challenges that exist with the regulated healthcare space and lean. And the first is, I think, doing more stuff pre-product. So actually, you know, you can kind of follow that cycle without having a product at all, right? You can do various different levels of kind of testing, either by just doing Q&As with patients or clinicians, focus groups, getting out there, speaking to people, doing a lot more in terms of kind of competitor analysis, what others have done, what's been a success. There's a huge amount of open source data out there that you can actually use to kind of get a little bit further down that road than you would do if you were just starting from scratch.
Yeah. You mean more from the lean phase, which is shown here?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah,
okay.
And before we kind of get to that, the agile process, I think there's more that I think you can do than I think probably one would expect in the healthcare space before you get to that. And then the second, just from, again, a really healthcare specific thing, is if you're trying to build a product that's requires regulation in some form or another, whether that's on the healthcare side or on the life science side, or requires regulatory oversight, there are sometimes things you can do to kind of try these things out in a different way. And what I mean, for an example, is that we when we're providing our sort of clinical trial platform, we're doing this in a quality improvement. We initially did this using kind of quality improvement programs, which aren't subject to the same level of regulation as formal kind of clinical studies, and you can still show the process. And actually, the difference between a kind of quality improvement program and clinical research, whilst there are substantial differences, you know, the kind of process of finding patients, engaging them, and consolidating data actually doesn't differ enormously, and you can do a lot of that agile iteration in that environment before you take the leap into doing sort of fully regulated products?
Thank you. I see that there's another question. Does building in Agile affect my roadmap, and how long should my roadmap be ideally? Basically, building in Agile always affects the roadmap, because this is the whole purpose of it. Initially, you start with a roadmap, and you make a plan, and you identify some key features you're planning to develop, and some key phases of the project where you want to go. But the Agile is all about learning and adjusting, and from that perspective, it always affects the roadmap, because let's say after a few sprints, and after validating between the sprints with the customers, and collecting opinions from people, you might end up to render some of the items in the roadmap irrelevant, and items to it. So and my short answer, yes, it always affects the roadmap. Yep, and also the second question is how long should my roadmap be ideally? Basically, something which is recommended is that each version should take about 6 months, let's say. So when making a roadmap, it's good to make a roadmap version by version, even if you have some longer term plans. It would be good that every several sprints you deliver something to the production environment. Of course, it vastly depends on the size of the project and the scale of your idea, pretty much. But something like a version every 6 months, it's usually quite doable, and it works well. Okay. Yeah, we are running a bit late in time, so I suggest that we can finish, and you can always reach us on LinkedIn and email, so feel free to contact us, and we can answer, we can try at least to answer your questions, and also discuss whatever cases might appear, and especially because when we're talking about lean startup might mean a separate company, but it could also be a project into already established organization, which could be executed in lean and agile ways. So this is something which also can be considered by larger organizations and already established businesses. So to treat an internal project like a lean startup, and running it agile, and constantly evaluating and constantly running this cycle of building and learning and measuring the results. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.